Welcome back to another episode of the D-League. Today, episode 29, and Bilal and I will go back to weapons today. Previously, we talked about ranged weapons, and today we're going to talk about melee weapons in video games, how they're implemented or what you have to keep in mind. And when you think, what are melee weapons? It's pretty much close combat. So stuff like knives or swords or maybe a hammer, something like that. And to be honest, in my opinion, melee weapons are actually more difficult to implement than projectile-based weapons. But we'll get into that in a moment. And so concerning the mechanics of melee weapons, I generally have this picture of startup, active phase, and then recovery. So, for example, if you have a hammer, then the startup would be the swing animation where the arm goes back, where you get you pull back the arm to get a higher speed when hitting. And then the active phase would be when the hammer is going down, where you have it in front of you and you hit downwards. And then the recovery would be like when you kind of lose the velocity in the hit, where you kind of lose speed. And then, of course, you have to get it back up. So that would be the recovery phase, where the hammer is in front of you, but you cannot, it wouldn't make sense that it does damage at that point. So that's the recovery phase. So kind of startup and recovery is where you have animation, but you don't deal damage. And then the active phase is where you have an animation and you deal damage. And I think concerning mechanics, do you also agree? That's how you imagine close combat melee weapons?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate. I mean, there hasn't really been a game that hasn't used a different system than that. But I mean, yeah, it's ultimately always, no matter what solution you're using, there's a startup, active, and then recovery.
I mean, some people might say, but what about a chainsaw? Doesn't have maybe you have it in front of you all the time, so it's
But
always active. But I think even in I guess in most first-person shooters or other games where you might have a chainsaw, maybe the startup is very short and the active time is it's active until you release the button or you stop attacking. So in this case it would be kind of you can extend the active phase of the weapon forever in this case.
Yeah, ultimately it is still, I mean, a startup and active and recovery, right? I mean, you can argue they'll have an instant startup or instant recovery, but I mean, ultimately they're there. No melee weapon is always active, but they can be if the player decides that he wants to perpetually hold down his left mouse button.
Yeah, exactly. And right now I mentioned the chainsaw, and so I thought how does hitting actually work with melee weapons as a mechanic? Because you kind of can you have to decide, does the weapon hit once and then you lose the ability to hit something, even if it's during the active animation, the active phase of the weapon, or does it keep the ability to deal damage even though you hit? So
Yeah.
maybe, for example, if you have a knife, then you would need to decide, okay, can you just hit once for, let's say, 30 damage? Or do you say, okay, the longer you make contact with the knife, the more damage you deal. So
Uh-huh.
maybe if you hit, um, if you have a frame where you hit, then maybe it does 1 damage. So you, in this case, you would need to hit the opponent for 30 frames to do 30 damage. Um, but yeah, I guess that's more difficult to kind of implement, especially on platforms like the PC. I I saw some bugs concerning this, but
Oh
let's
boy.
talk about that in a moment. Or should we talk about that already? I
Eh,
guess.
no, no, let's. I think we can go through all the types of everything first,
Okay.
right? Because yeah.
So yeah, that's it. You have to kind of decide: does it hit once, or is it a continual like
Uh-huh.
damage source, let's say?
Yeah.
And also then you also have to decide, how does the melee weapon actually work? Is it, if you, let's say, swing a hammer, do you like hit a specific area in front of your character with the weapon, where you say,
Hmm.
okay, you have the active animation, but it's always like a pillar in front of you. It's fixed no matter like how the animation looks. You just hit this area. Or is it actually collision based, which means that, um, let's say you have two characters, so you attack the other character, and to deal damage, if it's collision based, then it would mean that your hammer would need to touch the model of the other character to actually deal damage. So, for example, you could, if you don't do that, then maybe the animation looks like you are hitting, let's say, the arm, or
Hmm.
like the foot, and but you are actually not hitting. Like, even though the hammer is in the foot, um, it's not the like the damage model of that character model.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
he cannot take, or he doesn't take damage because your attack area is not touching the damage area of the other character. But if it was collision based, you would have hittable areas on the whole body. So you just have to touch the model to hit.
Yeah.
So in this case, if your hammer touches the foot, then you hit the foot. And I guess that's also a design decision, how you want to kind of implement it.
Hmm.
Um, because I guess if you do it collision based, then maybe you can, let's say, kill somebody by slicing his hand or hitting his foot or something.
Hmm.
While if you do an area based attack, then you would probably have a damage area more around the center of the body. So like the arms or legs are moving, but you cannot actually hit those. Might be a bit,
Yeah.
could
I mean,
could be confusing, but not necessarily, depending on how you do the hit and hurt boxes or damage areas.
yeah, that's true. Though you can always mix and match them. I did want to say, actually, before I like going forward with the rest of the like how it works. I think with hitting, you mentioned like one hit or like continual damage, and I think what's also an increasingly common sort of thing is well, there are a couple things. One would be where you only hit each thing once. So like if you swung an axe, and say you're like killing zombies, right? So you swing an axe through one zombie and it only hits that zombie once, and then it'll
Hmm.
also hit the next one once, for example. And then there's also in a lot of newer games, there's this new feature that's like really a lot more immersive than in previous games, where when you hit something, depending on the weapon, it'll like bounce back, right? So you hit something, then it does one like a damage hit to him, then it goes into a recovery state where you're pulling the weapon right back rather than just continuing the swing. The
Hmm.
animation will actually like cancel. Um, so I think those are some also interesting things to think about. I know it can really make the game a lot more fun. Like for example, if you actually like one shot two zombies with one axe swing, for example. Um, but yeah, in terms of how it works, you said you mentioned hit area and collision based, which are I agree with both of those. I think there's also um, rather than just an area. Like sometimes it'll actually work like a gun, which is in my opinion pretty stupid, but kind of like a laser gun, right? So it'll literally shoot a ray forward to check a distance. Um, so if your weapon has a range of 5, right, then it'll check 5 units in front of you, but only in that one moment where the active state is applied, right? And then it'll go into recovery where it's not active anymore.
Hmm.
So it's basically just like shooting a gun if the gun were to be like a distance check, which is pretty stupid. If you've played Daisy mod or PUBG, those both have pretty very very bad melee, right? And Daisy had it literally was a gun, so it's not even really worth mentioning actually. So it would make a firing sound. And in PUBG, it also does this startup active recovery, but it does it in a way that's like very noticeable and makes it feel clunky and gross. So the melee is pretty much useless. Like you just don't really use it unless there are no guns. And that's because it kind of uses. I'm not sure if it's an area or array, but either way, it's very like the player has to be right in front of you, and you have to be like in them, and all those kinds of issues. So
Hmm.
um, yeah, just stuff to think about. Um, you want to avoid unrealistic, or not unrealistic, but things that aren't really respective of the animation, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, I guess we can move on to my next point, which would be that uh, I I mean mechanics is also things like stats for the weapon. So I think like the stats must fit the type of weapon. For example, if you have a
Mm-hmm.
hammer, like a really big hammer, and it
Yeah.
does less damage than a small knife, but like the attack rate is much faster for the hammer than the small knife, it kind of feels unlogical. Like that's not how physics work. It's heavier, so yeah. How can you attack faster with a heavier weapon than like this small knife that you can move very freely? And
Uh-huh.
with the like with stats, it would be like in this case, let's say you have the startup active recovery, of course. Like the speed of the in this case, it would be like the attack speed of the weapon. So, for example, the small knife, if you want to make it more realistic or feel realistic, then you would probably you would give it a short startup. You would give it a maybe a short like a short active phase because you
Mm-hmm.
swing it very fast, and
Yeah.
a short recovery phase. But y- because like it attacks so quickly,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not much of a commitment to attack with a small knife. You would give it less damage, like a lower damage value.
Yeah.
While with a hammer, all the animations would be longer, and maybe you would give that like the hammer a bigger area of like damage, like where you're actually hitting, or like you said. maybe you can, like, you swing the hammer around your character or something like that to make up for the disadvantages in speed and startup and recovery.
Yeah.
And so you would give that a higher damage value because it's more difficult to hit others, or because it's much more of a commitment to the attack. And I guess that's also important to keep in mind when you want to design melee weapons, that they kind of make sense, or like the player can actually use them intuitively. Maybe, for example, the chainsaw, you can just hold it in front of you, or you could still swing it. So maybe you would give the holding the chainsaw in front less lower damage because it's always active, while like swinging the chainsaw would be higher startup, higher activity, active phase, higher recovery. No, not actually active phase. It would be a shorter active phase actually, but startup and recovery are longer. So to make it like viable, you would give it more damage.
Yeah.
Or area of effect damage, something like that.
Yeah. Wouldn't say I really have anything to add to that, but I think like Elder Scrolls obviously has like this very I guess it's very applied in Elder Scrolls, like daggers and hammers and swords, and great swords will all have like different speeds and damage and active times. So that's one example.
Yeah. So before we that's it for me concerning mechanics. Is there anything you would like to add first before we might let's talk about bugs in a moment?
No, that's that's all the stuff that is like common.
Okay, so we, like I mentioned, you have to decide to give weapons the ability to hit once or for a longer period of time. And one bug that I saw recently was in Resident Evil 7 during it's not a cutscene, but like you have an enemy character come through the wall with, I think, some weapon. So like the wall crumbles and the character comes into the room, and so that character is in a fixed animation for this sequence. And at that point, usually the knife only hits once in the game, but in this case, it hits every frame that the weapon is inside the body of that other character. So in that case, you actually deal more damage if you have a higher FPS, because the animation is, in theory, it's the same length. It looks the same, but because the game is rendering more frames, the animation is actually longer. So, for example, at 60 FPS, if you say the swing animation is 60 FPS until, like, let's say it's active for 60 frames, actually. But and it does damage on every frame, let's say 1 damage. But if you have 300 FPS, so frames per second, the active phase changes from 60 to actually 300 frames. It looks identical, but just because the game is rendering more frames, suddenly does 300 damage instead of 60. And of course, those are not the actual values for Resident Evil 7 in this case, but it's kind of how that bug works, where you actually deal like more damage the higher your frames per second rendered are in this situation. And I guess that's something a developer has to keep in mind if you might have an issue like this. And I guess especially if you keep the ability to hit active for the whole active phase, then you might actually run into the same problem where you have melee weapons destroy everything with one hit because the player is rendering 400, 500 frames per second. And then maybe because you coded that game on your old laptop that could only handle, let's say, 70, it was fine on your laptop, but on that player's PC, suddenly everything dies with a touch of any melee weapon, and that's I guess that kind of destroys like the balance between melee weapons as well. Like I mentioned, hammer and small knife. So why would you use the hammer if the small knife kills everything right away? Because you deal 10 times the damage because of the frame rate.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I was just gonna say I can't really think of many bugs, but I know that I guess to go more in detail on why PUBG's melee is so bad is because we already kind of talked about how PUBG sort of has this rubber banding issue where players will be pulled back and it's kind of laggy. So if you are running at a player, it's pretty much impossible to hit somebody with the system that it has. And so because it has that kind of I don't know if it's area or if it's array, but it basically where your crosshair is, it'll have an active where if you punch or swing a crowbar or whatever, it'll hit in that one frame, I guess. And only if they're in range, right? Rather than be an actual collider or something more reasonable, like a wider area. It'll basically hit in the center of the screen, kind of like Team Fortress, but with bad netcode. So yeah, I mean that's why ultimately that system is not really good. I mean, you can't really outplay anybody with the melee. Basically, all you can do is if you get them cornered in a building, then you can punch them in the head or hit them with an axe a couple times. So yeah, that's pretty much the only example I can think of right now for really terrible melee.
Well, another thing I can imagine, I'm not sure if I actually played a game with that problem, but if you do it, like you mentioned, melee weapons actually functioning like ranged weapons, is that if you also use damage spheres where the attack is actually hitting, then you could it could look like you're hitting the other character, but actually you are hitting the area behind the enemy. So your sword is inside of the the enemy model, but because the attack sphere is actually behind the damage model of the enemy, you don't hit. I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't think of a first person shooter example, but I know that some older platformers or something like, let's say something like Shaq Fu, which is, well, it's a fighting game, but these games sometimes had the problem in the past that you throw a punch, but the opponent is too close, So like the punch is going right through the model or like the sprite, and then like the hit is on the fist, but because the fist is like behind the characters, the enemy sprite, yeah, you don't hit. So
Okay.
that's great, especially if you get punched all the time. Like if the enemy has a good close ranged animation, and he can actually hit you, but you cannot hit back because your range is too high, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Interesting.
also something to keep in mind. I think Time Cop had that problem, but that game is pretty trash mechanical wise.
Okay. What was? Oh yeah, actually, you mentioned stuff like the model going through players but not actually hitting, which is actually one other thing to keep in mind is like I guess if you're making one like a melee focused game, is that when you swing like a melee weapon and it's a view model, like players will basically okay, I guess I should explain. Like a view model is a model that is displayed in the screen space of the camera rather than actually in the world. And typically, a view model is only shown to the current player's camera. So, like the local player in a multiplayer game will see his arms in as view models, but then in third person, it'll actually be a different model entirely, right? And so, I think in the future, we probably at some point will move off of view models, but not soon. But something to consider is that it will be unrealistic melee, like from your perspective, if you're in a view model, simply because it's not actually in the world. So if you're doing a collision-based, attacks, you might want to consider making the player actually see their third-person model rather than view models. So yeah, another thing to keep in mind.
All right, then let's move on to the visual part of melee weapons. I guess. Well, I guess the visuals are kind of like not that exciting to talk about. I mean,
Yeah.
the animation must give the player the information where the weapon is actually hitting. I mean, it doesn't make sense if you stab a knife just forward that you hit to the right or left. So, like, the weapon just has to hit where the animation is, like, making you think it's hitting. Especially, I guess the animation is most important when you actually make it collision based, because the animation is is where the weapon is hitting. Because if you have a sword, then if you attack, due to the collision based system, you would have the sword be able to hit wherever the sword model actually is and touching during the active animation. So it also kind of makes the weapon good or bad how the animation works in this case. You could have a stab forward with very low, like it just hits right in the center of your screen, but then you could just swing it left and right or like diagonally, and then suddenly you hit above your character, below your character, left and right of your character, and then suddenly it's a much better weapon, right? So that's very important if you use a collision-based system, to keep in mind how you actually gonna do the animation. And of course, the animation also must make sense for the weapon type. I mean, stabbing with a hammer doesn't make much sense. Like you're just like poking at the enemy, and yeah, that's kind of stupid, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, keep that in mind. What kind of weapon you are actually using, and then adjust the animation in this case, depending on the weapon.
Yeah, for me, I think to add to visuals, I think the what was it? Oh man, I lost my train of thought. But I was thinking about oh yeah, matching. So the animation should match pretty much everything else, right? So I mean, in game development, all the other stuff in game development, so like sound and the actual gameplay. So like what I mentioned before with some games like let you hit something and then bounce back. So for example, if your weapon only hits one thing at a time, then maybe you want to have that bounce back feature in there. And you also really want the hit to match the animation. So if you only hit in the center of the screen, then the animation should be in the center of the screen when that frame is going on. And then also, if you're, I guess, when that happens, like at the center of the screen, that part, if you hit somebody, like during that, is when the sound should play. It shouldn't happen before the sword actually hits. I remember Team Fortress 2's Melee was fun, but it was like really unrealistic. And I remember that one part of it was, I think, the Claymore that the demo man could equip. If you swung it, then it would actually hit a little bit before the center, so like you'd hear the hitting sound even before he like actually did the swing. So, so it was during the swing, but like before before the active state. So like you could cut some guy's head off like without actually hitting him yet. So
Okay.
something to keep in mind.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you talked about if you have a multiplayer game, then that the animation must also fit for the other player, like that is seeing you in this case. I mean, if an attack just looks like it's going just forward, and then suddenly, like, you're on the side of the other character, but you still get hit, even though the character's swinging his sword up and down in front of him. Just like it looks like that, but maybe for the other player it looks different. Then yeah, I guess that's kind of stupid as well.
Yeah.
So you also have to keep in mind how the animation looks from an outer perspective as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Else there is nothing else I have to add for visuals in this case.
Yeah, that was everything I wanted to say, I think, on visuals.
I guess, yeah, concerning melee weapons, it's kind of boring because you just have to think how would it work in real life and then do it like that. Maybe in video games it's a bit wonky where maybe you turn around during a swing animation and like you're swinging up from above you downwards, and then you turn and then suddenly you do damage because it's still the active animation, but you kind of in real life you would just bump the sword sideways at somebody and I doubt it will hurt much. But,
exactly.
yeah, I guess in video games, it's video games. People will excuse your mistake.
Yeah, and actually on that topic, really briefly, there are a couple mods in Skyrim that will make it so they like lock your turning. So that's like one feature that's possible is making your turning like a lot slower if you're swinging to make that a little more realistic.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of cool. All right, so do you have any final comments then?
Don't do what DayZ did and make the gun an actual, or the melee weapon an actual gun.
And make
That's about
the
it.
gun actually a melee weapon. What?
Exactly. It actually makes a shooting noise.
I'm shooting my rocket launcher. Why does it just hit in front of me?
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add as well. just make it work properly. Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. And maybe if you have cool ideas, I guess with melee weapons, it's a lot about design as well. Like knives and hammers might be boring, so design something cool. No, I guess that's my advice. If you want to create a cool melee weapon, then do something creative.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in melee field.
Yeah. All right, then that's it for this week, and I guess we have another anniversary coming up again next week with episode 30, and I hope our listeners will join us again. I hope you listen to every anniversary episode at least. I don't know which topic we talked about in both of them, but
yeah, I also don't.
Yeah, good stuff. We don't know what we are talking about. Anyway, just join us for our next anniversary, and if you have any comments, any feedback, then let us know. Always interested in hearing what you guys think. Maybe you got a huge sword fetish. Maybe you want to show us your big hammer. And just do it in the comments. Just
it's time we ended this. It's going too far.
Yeah. PG-18.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, then. Thanks for listening this week, and tune in again next week, guys. Until then, have a nice week.